The letter in Jude Callahan's pocket was 3 months old. The paper softened to the texture of worn cotton. Its edges were dark with the sweat of long days in the saddle, and the ink had blurred in a dozen places, but he knew the words by heart. Find a good woman, son. A woman of substance. Someone to build a life with before I'm gone. His mother's handwriting, usually so firm, had wavered at the end, a testament to the sickness that was slowly claiming her back in Ohio. So Jude, a man more comfortable with the weight of a colt than the weight of conversation, was riding through the Nevada heat of 1878 on a fool's errand, wife hunting. He'd tried the respectable avenues first. He'd spoken to a preacher in dusty Carson City who'd offered a list of pious widows. He'd sat through an excruciatingly polite tea with a rancher's stern-faced daughter, a woman who had looked at his calloused hands and the faint scar bisecting his left eyebrow as if they were personal insults. Each encounter left him feeling more fraudulent than the last. He was Jude Callahan. Men stepped aside when he walked into a saloon. He could read a trail, track a man for 100 miles, and live on jerky and grit for a week. But he did not know how to talk about church socials or the price of calico. His mother's request felt like being asked to describe the color of the wind. Now he was following the last, most desperate lead, a name mentioned by a freight wagon driver who'd simply said, "There's a widow out past the dry creek, keeps to herself, works the old Miller place." The driver had spat a stream of tobacco juice. A hard worker, that one. Hard work was something Jude understood. He had imagined a stout German woman or a stoic Swede, someone weathered and practical. But when he crested the last rise, the sight of the ranch made a hard knot form in his stomach. The Miller place was a ruin. The corral fence sagged like a broken spine. The barn door hung from a single hinge, and the small clapboard house looked as if a strong wind would carry it off. Dust and neglect were the only crops growing here. This was not a place of substance. It was a place of ghosts. He almost turned his horse around. This was a waste of time, an insult to his mother's wish. But then he saw her. A lone figure, kneeling in a patch of ground near the house that showed the only signs of life, a small, struggling vegetable garden. She was small-boned, her black hair pulled back in a severe knot. She wore a high-collared garment, a dress of some kind, made of a thin gray fabric that was faded and patched in several places. As he drew closer, he realized she was Chinese. This was not what he had expected. This was not what anyone would have expected. In a territory where Chinese women were a rarity, often confined to the laundries and kitchens of larger towns, or the closed-off communities of railroad workers, a lone woman on a failing ranch was an anomaly. It was a danger. He dismounted, the squeak of his saddle leather loud in the oppressive silence. His horse, Apollo, shook its head, jingling the bridle. The woman looked up, her movement sharp and sudden, like a startled quail. Her face was fine-boned, her eyes dark and unreadable. She got to her feet in a single, fluid motion, brushing dirt from her hands onto the gray fabric of her dress. She didn't speak. She just watched him, her posture radiating a stillness that was not fear, but a deep, weary caution. "Ma'am," Jude said, his voice raspy from the dust. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect he hadn't felt compelled to make in a long time. "I was told a Mrs. Miller lived out here." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "My husband was Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice was quiet, her English clipped but clear. "He is gone." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jude said, the words feeling clumsy and hollow. He gestured vaguely at the parched landscape. "I'm just passing through. My horse could use some water, if you've got any to spare." It was a lie. His canteens were full, but it was the only excuse he could think of to linger, to try and understand the impossible picture in front of him. She gave a short, sharp nod and turned toward a hand-dug well near the house. Jude followed, leading Apollo. He watched her work the pump handle. It was stiff, and she had to put her entire small frame into each pull. The groan of the mechanism was painful, and only a trickle of water came out. She filled a wooden bucket with painstaking slowness. "That pump needs grease," he observed, his voice gentler than he intended. She didn't look at him. "There is no grease," she said, as if stating a fact as immutable as the sun in the sky. He watched her hands on the worn wood of the handle. They were slender, but the knuckles were swollen and the skin chapped. These were not the hands of a helpless woman. These were the hands of someone who had fought for every drop of water, every stubborn vegetable in that small garden. He thought of the rancher's daughter and her soft, pale hands that had never known a splinter. Without a word, Jude took the handle from her. The metal was hot to the touch. He worked it, his greater strength and weight bringing up a more satisfying gush of water. He filled the bucket, then a trough for Apollo. He drank from the dipper himself, the water tasting of iron and earth. When he was done, he looked at her. She was watching him again, that same impenetrable stillness in her gaze. "My name is Jude Callahan," he said. She hesitated for a long moment. "I am May," she said. Just the one name. Before he could say more, the sound of an approaching rider made them both turn. A portly man, on a fine-looking bay horse, was making his way up the path. He wore a tweed coat, despite the heat, and a smug, proprietary air. He rode straight up to the house, ignoring Jude completely, and fixing his gaze on May. "Well now, May," the man said, his voice oozing a false geniality. "Still trying to scratch a living out of this dust bowl? I told you, my offer is more than fair. You can't manage this place alone." May's chin lifted. "This is my home, Mr. Sterling. It is not for sale." Sterling chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "It's not a home, it's a liability. Your husband, God rest his soul, he understood business. He also understood debts. Debts that must be paid." He finally acknowledged Jude with a dismissive glance. "You have company. I hope he's not giving you any trouble." Jude stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Sterling and May. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, his height and the quiet confidence in his posture a stark contrast to Sterling's bluster. "The lady isn't selling," Jude said, his tone flat and even. Sterling's eyes, small and porcine, narrowed. He took in Jude's worn gun belt, the dust of the trail on his clothes, and the competent way he held himself. He was used to intimidating a lone woman, not a man who looked like he'd seen the underside of the world and wasn't impressed by it. "This is a private matter, friend," Sterling said, his voice losing some of its warmth. "Between me and the widow." "Didn't sound private," Jude replied. "Sounded like you were trying to bully a woman into giving up her property." A flicker of anger crossed Sterling's face. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, a big fish in a small, dry pond. "You don't know the situation. Her husband owed me a considerable sum. The land is collateral." "Then you'll have the papers to prove it," Jude said. It wasn't a question. Sterling's mouth tightened. "I do, back in my office. But it doesn't matter. She can't work this claim. The law is clear on that. A homestead must be improved. This," he said, waving a dismissive hand at the dilapidated ranch, "is not an improvement." He spurred his horse, turning it in a tight circle. "Think about my offer, May. It's the last one." He galloped off, kicking up a cloud of angry dust. The silence he left behind was thick with unspoken things. Jude looked at May. Her face was a pale, stoic mask. but he saw the faint tremor in her hands. She was not unafraid. She was just practiced at hiding it. "He comes every week," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He wants the water rights from the creek." Jude looked past the house to the thin line of cottonwoods that marked the dry creek bed. It wasn't much, but in this arid land, it was everything. "The pump," he said, changing the subject. "I've got some axle grease in my saddlebag. It'll help." She nodded, a small, jerky movement. He went to his horse, retrieved the can of grease and a rag, and set to work on the squealing pump mechanism. May watched him, her arms crossed over her chest. He worked methodically, cleaning the old dirt away before applying the new grease. The sun beat down on his back. He could feel her eyes on him, studying him. He wasn't used to being looked at with such quiet intensity. When he was finished, he worked the handle. It moved smoothly now, with a quiet sigh instead of a tortured groan. A steady stream of clear water flowed into the bucket. He looked up at her, a smudge of grease on his cheek. For the first time, he saw something shift in her expression, a crack in the careful facade. It might have been gratitude. It might have been surprise. He did not yet know that the debt Sterling spoke of was not measured in gold or silver, but in a secret buried with May's husband. He stayed. He told himself it was because the homestead was on the way to the next town, and Apollo could use the rest. He told himself it was because a man couldn't just ride off and leave a woman to the mercies of a vulture like Sterling. He didn't tell himself the real reason, which was that he was intrigued by the quiet strength of this woman who fought a losing battle against the sun and the dust with nothing but her own 2 hands. He spent the afternoon mending the worst section of the corral fence, using salvaged wood and old nails he straightened one by one on a flat rock. May did not ask him to help, nor did she thank him when he did. She simply brought him a tin cup of water and then went back to her own work, weeding the garden with a fierce, focused energy. They worked in a shared silence that was surprisingly comfortable. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, she went inside the small house. A few minutes later, a thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Jude finished his work and washed his hands and face at the newly silent pump. He expected to be on his way, to unroll his bedroll a few miles down the trail, but May appeared in the doorway. "You should eat," she said. It was a statement, not an invitation. He hesitated, then nodded. The inside of the house was sparse and impeccably clean. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room. A small stove, a dry sink, and a few shelves holding dishes and jars lined one wall. A curtained-off area likely hid her bed. There were no decorations, no pictures, no softness anywhere, except for a small, folded piece of embroidered silk sitting on a shelf, its bright colors a stark contrast to the drab surroundings. She served him a bowl of rice and vegetables from her garden, seasoned with something savory and unfamiliar. It was simple food, but it was hot and filling. They ate without speaking. Jude was used to eating alone, but this was different. The silence wasn't empty. It was shared. He found himself watching her, the delicate way she held her chopsticks, the focused grace of her movements. After the meal, as twilight settled in the small window, he finally spoke. "Sterling mentioned your husband's debts." May looked down at her empty bowl. "My husband, Way, he was a good man, but he was hopeful. He believed in the word of others." She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "He came here from the railroad camps in California. He wanted a piece of land, a place to be left alone. Mr. Sterling sold him this claim. He helped him. He acted as a friend." "And Way borrowed money from him," Jude guessed. She nodded. "For seed, for tools, for the house. Way signed papers. He did not read English well. he trusted. And now Sterling claims the debt gives him the land. Yes. Her voice was flat. After the fever took him this past winter, Mr. Sterling came. He said the papers gave him everything. I told him no. This was Way's dream. You've held him off for months by yourself, Jude said, a note of admiration in his voice. I do not know how much longer I can, she admitted, and the confession seemed to cost her something. I have no money for a lawyer. I have only the land, and the land is what he wants. She rose and went to the shelf, picking up a small leather-bound book. She brought it to the table. Way told me to keep this. He said it was important. Jude opened it. The pages were filled with columns of characters he couldn't understand. It was a ledger of some kind, written entirely in Chinese. He looked at her. Can you read it? She shook her head. I never learned the characters. Way was teaching me, but there was not enough time. A ledger she couldn't read. A debt she couldn't pay. A promise she couldn't break. Jude felt a familiar, cold anger settle in his gut. It was the same anger he felt when he saw a cheat in a card game or a bully preying on a weaker man. Sterling wasn't just a land grabber. He was a thief of a dead man's dream. The next morning, they came. Sterling was not alone this time. He was accompanied by a man wearing the badge of a territorial marshal. The marshal was a gaunt, tired-looking man who seemed to take no pleasure in his work. Sterling, however, was beaming. He held up a piece of paper with a flourish. This is a legal writ of eviction, May, he announced, signed and sealed, based on the loan agreement signed by your late husband. The circuit judge reviewed it, the land, the house. It's all mine now. The marshal is here to see that you vacate the premises peacefully. May stood in the doorway of her small house, a frail sentinel in her worn gray dress. She did not speak, but her body was rigid with defiance. The marshal looked from Sterling to Jude, his eyes lingering on Jude's holstered pistol. Sir, I'd advise you not to interfere. This is official territorial business. Jude looked at the paper in Sterling's hand, then at May's pale, determined face. He thought of his mother's letter, of his quest for a woman of substance. He had been looking in all the wrong places. Substance wasn't about money or social standing. It was about this. It was about standing on a piece of worthless land and defending a dead man's hope because you had given your word. He could ride away. This was not his fight. Getting involved meant trouble, the kind that followed a man. It meant making an enemy of a powerful local figure and putting himself on the wrong side of a lawman's badge. His simple mission to find a wife had become a dangerous entanglement. He looked at May, and in that moment he made a choice. He was no longer just passing through. The lady isn't going anywhere, Jude said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of finality. He stepped forward, taking the writ from Sterling's hand. He didn't tear it. He simply folded it neatly and handed it back. This document is based on a debt. We'll see the debt paid, but she is not leaving her home. Sterling sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. Paid? With what? She's destitute. And who are you to decide? I'm her partner, Jude said, the words surprising him as much as anyone else. He looked at May, whose eyes widened almost imperceptibly. We're partners in this claim, and we'll be seeing a lawyer in Carson City about the terms of this supposed loan. The marshal sighed, looking from Jude's calm face to Sterling's furious one. A partnership changes things, Sterling. A claim being worked by two people, one of them a citizen, it complicates the eviction. You'll have to take it back to the judge. He looked at Jude. Don't make me regret this, Callahan. He tipped his hat to May and rode off, leaving Sterling fuming in the dust. Jude had just bought them time, but it had cost him his anonymity, his simple path. He had tied his fate to this woman and her barren stretch of land. He had chosen a side. 3 months later, the autumn air had a crisp edge to it, and the leaves of the cottonwood trees along the creek were a brilliant yellow. The Miller Ranch, as it was still called by the few who passed it, looked different. The corral fence was straight and strong, enclosing 2 new goats and a handful of chickens. The barn door was rehung, and the roof of the house had a solid new patch. The garden had yielded a modest but vital harvest, and jars of preserved vegetables now lined the shelves inside. Jude had taken the ledger to a merchant in Carson City's Chinatown. The old man had translated it. It wasn't a record of debts Way owed. It was a meticulous record of the money Sterling had extorted from him and other Chinese railroad workers, disguised as loans and supply fees. Way had been collecting evidence. Armed with this and the last of his own money to hire a proper lawyer, Jude had faced Sterling not with a gun, but with the truth. The writ was exposed as fraudulent, based on a predatory contract. Sterling, faced with a territorial investigation, had withdrawn his claim and disappeared from the county. The fight had been quiet, waged with papers and patience, but it had been a fight nonetheless. Through it all, Jude and May had worked side by side. They had rebuilt the ranch board by board, row by row. They rarely spoke of what had passed between them, of the word partner that Jude had spoken in the heat of the moment. But it hung in the air, a settled fact. He had become her partner in work, in rebuilding, in survival. And somewhere in the shared labor of summer days and the quiet meals of autumn evenings, he had become her partner in life. He learned the meaning of her silences, and she learned to read the thoughts in his steady gaze. He discovered a sharp wit beneath her quiet exterior, and she found a deep well of kindness beneath his hardened one. One evening he sat at the table, a fresh sheet of paper and a pen before him. He was finally writing the letter to his mother. He looked up and watched May through the open doorway. She was scattering feed for the chickens, her movements filled with an easy, unhurried grace. She was no longer wearing the tattered gray dress. She had sewn herself a new one from a bolt of dark blue calico he'd bought in town. It was simple and practical, but on her it looked beautiful. He dipped the pen in the ink. He began to write, not of a wife he had found to fulfill a duty, but of a woman who had shown him what it meant to build a home. He wrote that he had found a woman of substance, a woman whose strength was quieter and deeper than any he had ever known. He wrote that he was not coming back to Ohio because he was already home. He had come to Nevada looking for a name to put on a marriage certificate. He had found instead a life to put his heart into. The greatest journeys were not the ones that covered miles, he realized, but the ones that crossed the small, silent distance between 2 solitary souls. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.